Existentialist Society paper.
Welcome, everybody,
Oh,
to the Existentialist Society in Melbourne, Australia. I'm David Miller, the secretary.
can they see me?
They can see.
Existentialism is an umbrella term covering diverse and often conflicting schools of thought. Consequently, we are not agreed on who or what is an existentialist. We simply agree to disagree. Now, our speaker today is Dr. Colin Goodwin, who styles himself as an independent scholar. Colin has addressed the Existentialist Society many times over the decades, and his first lecture was back in June 1974, and he spoke on liberalism and existentialism, J.S. Mill and John Paul Sartre. So, Colin's topic today is yourself, your consciousness, your death, some crucial distinctions and connections. Colin, go ahead.
Thank you, David. Can you hear me?
Quite clearly.
Wonderful. Thanks, darling. I'm just farewelling my daughter. Will you be downstairs or? Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. A bit of a family exchange. Plainly at the very centre of consideration of and concern about conscious human selves or personalities is what one has to say regarding human consciousness. Permit me to introduce at the outset some statements, some reflections by people widely recognised for their expertise in the understanding of human consciousness. I start with the comment by Bruce Grayson, Doctor of Medicine and Emeritus Professor of Psychiatry and Neurobehavioral Sciences at the University of Virginia School of Medicine. Professor Grayson, your own consciousness is at once the most complex problem in the universe and also the simplest, most self-evident fact. I'm going to repeat that. Your own consciousness is at once the most complex problem in the universe and also the simplest, most self-evident fact. This comment leads at once into some relevant questions. What exactly is consciousness? How is it related to each individual person or self? What brings about this relationship? Does consciousness in some way create selfhood? That is, our existing as a self, when by a self is meant a living, persisting consciousness based on which there is an enduring individual identity. This comment of Bruce Grayson leads into the related comment of noted American philosopher Neil Grossman, Professor of Philosophy, the University of Illinois at Chicago. I quote, "There is perhaps no philosophical question more important than the question of whether consciousness is independent of the body, and hence whether the consciousness that constitutes our very selves survives the death of our body." I repeat that bit, whether consciousness is independent of the body, and hence whether the consciousness that constitutes our very selves survives the death of our body. This comment explicitly raises the issue of the relationship between consciousness and the body, more specifically, of course, the brain, whilst also explicitly declaring that consciousness is constitutive of the selfhood that each one of us experiences from a first-person perspective. Put a little bit differently, consciousness involves subjectivity, that is, existence as a subject. In what Australian philosopher David Chalmers, and I'll come back to him a bit later, what David Chalmers calls the hard problem of consciousness. A further few reflections about being conscious. One, note first of all the comment of, oh, that's the wrong one. Note first of all the comment of American psychic researcher and writer Cindy Dale. Quote, being conscious is what being alive is all about. What a remarkable statement. Being conscious is what being alive is all about. And one could add, this is what makes, say, one human being murdering another human being such an appalling act. It brings to an end a consciousness living a life that is perfectly adjusted to a physical universe, a life capable of happiness as opposed to unhappiness, fulfillment as opposed to frustration, enjoyment as opposed to suffering. The second person to whom I wish to refer here is Sir Karl Popper, arguably, or perhaps unarguably, the greatest philosopher of science of the 20th century. In the book, The Self and Its Brain, page 120, Popper says, I intend here to suggest that the brain is owned by the self rather than the other way round. I'll repeat that. I intend here to suggest that the brain is owned by the self rather than the other way round. Now, this is a very impressive thought. To own something is rightfully to have power or mastery over something. Using the word in the passive voice, to suggest that the brain is owned by the self is to suggest that the self has power or mastery over the brain, and therefore may use the brain in order to achieve the self's goals or interests, however small or trivial, or however great and important those goals or interests may be. The relationship between brain and self doesn't hold, doesn't work the other way round, to use Popper's words. This is so since it is reflectively obvious that in virtue of the consciousness that constitutes our very selves, to use Neil Grossman's words, each self is able to pursue its goals and interests, that is, rightfully to exercise power and mastery, whilst the brain, having no consciousness in its own right, but functioning merely as a physical instrument of the brain, is totally unable to exercise the power or mastery essential to the concept of ownership. Mary Smith, for example, can own a car or a house, but a car or a house cannot literally own Mary Smith. According to Karl Popper, the same sort of scenario applies to Mary Smith and her brain. She owns the brain, she's not owned by the brain. A connecting thought here, and I cite Larry Dossey, a university-based American physician and writer. Dossey says, we are conscious not because of the brain, but in spite of the brain. Again, a most interesting statement. We are conscious not because of the brain, but in spite of the brain. I next want to cite Aristotle, 384 BC to 322 BC. And he said in his marvelous ancient Greek, "He suke ta ontopos esti panta," which in medieval Latin is translated "anima est quodammodo omnia." In English, the consciousness or mind is, in a certain sense, everything. What's being asserted there is that as objects, things don't exist only in the world, but also in the psyche or anima or consciousness, that is, anima est quodammodo, no limits to things becoming objects. In other words, no limits to mental existence. He suke ta onta pos esti panta, as Aristotle quite brilliantly, I might say. He put it, that's in the Pedisukes, de anima in Latin, on the soul or mind in English, book 3, chapter 3, and in the famous Becker edition, page 431, column B, line 21. What this comes down to is that the mind, the suke or anima, is able to turn absolutely all things into objects simply by knowing them, without limits or boundaries. Things become objects. And as objects, things don't exist only in the physical world, but in the mind, in the suke, the psyche, or anima. That is, they exist objectively, objective in medieval Latin. There are no built-in limits to mental existence, to what the medievals called esse intentionale, in the sense of physical existence or being that tends into the mind in order to re-exist there with mental or non-physical existence. I can watch a car being driven down a street. The car, the street, and so on, all have physical existence. When I'm thinking about that event, they re-exist in the mind in some form of non-physical existence. Now, where are we? If I may come back to Larry Dossey, where are we? Professor Larry Dossey. Dossey had this to say very interestingly. In his book, What is Consciousness? 3 Sages Look Behind the Veil. Dossey said, "One night when I was 6, I lay sleepless in our farmhouse on the bleak central Texas prairie. I peered out the window at the canopy of stars shimmering in the night sky. I vividly remember the astonishment of being aware of them. Although I did not know grown-up words such as consciousness, I was simply amazed that I could know something, anything. My mind could have been a complete blank, but it wasn't. Yet why did there appear to be something rather than nothing? What was this awareness thing, and where did it come from? If no one were aware of anything, would anything still be there? And where did my awareness go when I went to sleep? These thoughts returned night after night, but without any answers." The next person I want to cite is Deborah Diamond, an extraordinarily interesting American, a Wall Street, New York money manager. She managed money for major United States companies. And she was at the time also professor at Johns Hopkins University. In 2008, she had an experience that transformed her, leaving her with special powers as a clairvoyant and medium, and total involvement in matters to do with human purpose and spirituality. When by spirituality, one simply means an interest in, concern about, involvement with realities or objects that transcend realities or objects confined or limited by the physics of space, time, and gravity. Now, Deborah Diamond had this to say: our consciousness is lodged in our dense physical bodies, which means we are never fully conscious until our consciousness separates at death. We are never fully conscious until our consciousness separates at death. This death is, of course, physical death, the death of each person's body. This notion implies that each self or person survives physical or bodily death and continues as a living, conscious subject of experiences. And how this subjectivity, this being a subject, comes about is what the Australian philosopher, and I return to him now, David Chalmers, refers to as, I quote, the hard problem of consciousness. We haven't, to cite Deborah Diamond's words, the slightest idea. Nobody has the slightest idea how anything material, in this case the central nervous system, could be conscious. The origin of the universe and consciousness is still one huge mystery to us. It's in Deborah Diamond, Life After Death, page 188. I'm tempted to add here from Isaac Asimov, the Russian author who lived in the United States. Life is pleasant. Death is peaceful. It's the transition that's troublesome. May I add a word of my own? The conserving of pulmonary, that is breathing activity, the conserving of cardiac activity, heartbeat, the conserving of cortical or neuronal activity, lead on to the conserving of consciousness, which is effectively the conserving of you, that is, of the relevant self. Next point. Our consciousness makes us what we are, human, and who we are. For example, Mary Smith as distinct from Bill Smith. Assuming, just for the moment, that our consciousness survives our physical death, that is, the death of our body, each one of us keeps going, that is, continues as a what and a who. So on this basis, the very identity of each one of us is an ongoing reality. This alleged survival of consciousness, of course, calls for strong evidence, and this can be provided. So our consciousness was, is, and will be our being a person. As Professor Neil Grossman, earlier quoted, put it, it is consciousness that constitutes our very selves. In relation to this insight, it is worth quoting the great Australian Nobel Prize winning neurophysiologist, Sir John Eccles. Eccles said, "We need today a renewal of faith in the great mystery and dignity of human existence, and to have hope that there will eventually come to each of us a realization of the cosmic meaning of this wonderful gift, our own personal self-consciousness, which in some mysterious way derives in part from the evolutionary development of life." Eccles had that to say in his Boyer lectures, The Brain and the Person, page 35. The role, evolution involves three features: spontaneous generation of a new organism, we'll say, random fluctuation, and survival of the fittest. Although in the United States, it tends to be survival of the fattest, but we won't go into that. The role of this personal self-consciousness is to record and retain through memory, in other words, to accumulate experiences whilst interpreting them. They are always experiences of something or other. All experiences involve interpretation. For example, I have a visual experience of an object that is interpreted by me in terms of a house, a paddock, and a clump of gum trees behind them. How does this interpretation arise? This interpretation arises on the basis of earlier interaction with other humans, that is, with other beings who have the sort of consciousness that duplicates the sort of consciousness that I have, and the shared language appropriate for expressing the content of this experience. Therefore, the related issue of education, however rudimentary or advanced, however unstructured or structured. We may well regard consciousness as a bubble that connects all of space and time and all that space and time contain, the entire cosmos, that connects all of this to us whose consciousness is able to contain them in terms of what the medieval philosophers call, we've already used the expression, called esse intentionale, existence, esse, that tends into consciousness in order to re-exist there with non-physical, that is, purely mental existence. Ultimately, of course, it is I who do the experiencing, drawing upon the relevant physical and psychological capacities that are mine. The medieval philosophers used the sentence, actiones sunt suppositorum. Actions belong to substances, and modus agendi sequitur modum ascendi. The manner of acting is consequent upon the manner of existing, as the same medieval philosophers put it. Therefore, myself, my consciousness are actively engaged. If I may cite Sir John Eccles again, thus we come to believe that there is a world of selves, each with the experience of inhabiting a body that is in a material world comprising innumerable bodies of like nature and a tremendous variety of other living forms. Let's have to move back. And an innumerable of like nature and a tremendous variety of other living forms and an immensity of apparently non-living matter. This material or objective world has the status of a second order or derivative reality. And for Eccles, the first order or non-derivative reality is our consciousness. The central nervous system is the link that connects the world of human mind, consciousness, to the world of matter, initially with and through one's own body, or more specifically, one's own brain. I am able at one go, so to speak, to consider, for example, the moon. Its mean distance is 384,400 kilometers from the Earth. Its maximum distance is 405,500 kilometers from the Earth. Its closest, if I can put it that way, its closest distance from the Earth is 353,300 kilometers from the Earth. I consider them all at one go. I consider at one go globally every galaxy in the universe, of which there are around 10 to the power 11, each with around 10 to the power 11 stars, a total therefore of around 10 to the power 22 stars, that is around 10,000 million stars. This scenario is the teleology, the directedness of the universe vis-a-vis human consciousness, a point not to be forgotten. If I may come back to John Eccles again, to introduce, when he is talking about consciousness, the phrase conscious experience. The phrase conscious experience. which he prefers to individual terms such as the very term consciousness, or other individual terms such as mind or mentality. Why this preference? I quote Sir John. I have chosen the expression conscious experience, and let me say, thereby risking, as it were, a bit of redundancy, I have chosen the expression conscious experience in order to stress the experienced character of consciousness in all its aspects. It will comprise all of your experiences in waking life and also your dreams. And that's on page 2 of his Gifford lectures. Not his Gifford lectures, his Boyer lectures. His Gifford lectures were quite different. There is a unity, I continue to quote him, there is a unity of the self through all these conscious experiences, each of which is assimilated to the self. It's page 6 of the text. That is, taken into and known by the self. Accordingly, the whole assemblage of conscious experiences throughout our lives has contributed to the formation of ourselves, to each one of us as a person. So, therefore, yourself, your consciousness, i.e. your conscious experiences, are seen actively together yet again. Permit me to begin at this stage with the assertion, and at this stage it is an assertion only, with the statement that we, that is human beings, live both sides of death. Death is the dividing line between this life and what is usually referred to as the afterlife, that is, life after this life. Cindy Dale, to come back to her again for a moment, says, to live fully is to stand in the passageway between life and death. She has that in The Journey After Life, page 120. This current life is specifically marked by a range of immediate and direct sensory experiences: visual, auditory, tactile, gustatory, olfactory. In other words, seeing, hearing, touching, tasting, smelling, corresponding to which is a varied range of interpretations, as previously noted. These are experiences that bind us to our physical universe, articulated as it is in terms of space and time. The spatio-temporal universe in which, as St. Paul succinctly puts it, we live and move and have our being. This is our life on one particular plane, within one particular existing metric framework. On the other side of death is life after this life, the afterlife. What can we know about the plane or metric framework to be found there? In his book, Heaven and Hell, the brilliant British thinker and writer Aldous Huxley wrote of what he called, I quote, the intensity of existence which animates every object, as operates in that work, pages 98 on to 99. Now, this animation of every object would certainly include animation of the afterlife and all that it includes on the assumption of its reality. So what is the afterlife said to include, and how do we know that? How do we know what it is said to include or contain? This is the point at which there comes into our discussion the concept of the near-death experience, the NDE, as it is shortened to, a concept introduced into educated Western thought by the American academic Raymond Moody, who moved from university lecturing in philosophy into medical training and practice. Dr. Moody decided that he was going to follow in the footsteps of his father, who was a medical practitioner, and he was going to shift from philosophy into medical training and practice. It's usually the other way around. Dr. Moody published in 1975 a book that was and remains epochal. The book was called Life After Life. The American neurosurgeon, University Medical Faculty professor, and prominent writer Eben Alexander wrote that, and I quote Alexander, "When future historians record the story of humankind's efforts to understand its place in the universe, they will see a crucial turning point in life after life." We have discussed yourself and your consciousness. Now let's look specifically at the concept of your death, and for the moment assume what we know about the near-death experience. We just assume that for the moment. Let's start with the distinction between dying, death, and being dead. Dying affects only someone who is still alive. As Woody Allen once put it, once quipped, dying would not be so bad if it were not followed by death. But as we well know, it is followed by death. Dying affects only someone who is still alive. It is a process of which the end point is death. This end point of the process of dying, namely death, points beyond itself to a state or condition, the state or condition of being dead, which is the initial or starting point of which is death. Cindy Dale, again, in her book, The Journey After Life, page 21, affirms that death is a matrix of consciousness that links concrete reality with intangible reality. I'll repeat that. Death is a matrix of consciousness that links concrete reality with intangible reality. In more challenging vein, the great English academic and writer Iris Murdoch declared that a death is the most terrible of facts. A death is the most terrible of facts. Is it possible to agree with this? First, let us note Cindy Dale again. To live fully is to stand in the passageway between life and death. The Journey After Life, page 20. We understand by life the coordinated, and this is life, the coordinated assembly of powers and activities that is being referred to when something is correctly described as living or being alive. The coordinated assembly of powers and activities when something that is being referred to correctly is being correctly described as living or being alive. There are, of course, as we well understand, levels of life: vegetal, sentient, intellective. With the basic level, vegetal, involving metabolism, the turning of non-living substances into living substances. Excuse the ringing of the phone, it won't be getting answered. The turning of non-living substances into living substances by digesting them. It includes growth, self-repair, reproduction. How then are we to define death, an instance of which is, according to Iris Murdoch, the most terrible of facts? Against the background of the concept of the near-death experience, the NDE, there are two relevant definitions of the concept of death. First of all, I apologize for that phone. There are two relevant definitions of the concept of death. First, there is death in the sense of simply the cessation of vital, that is from the Latin vita, life, simply the cessation of vital activities, cessation of pulmonary activity, in other words, the cessation of breathing, cessation of cardiac activity, in other words, the cessation of heartbeat, cessation of cerebral activity, cessation of action in the neurons of the cortex. This cessation of activity in the neurons of the cortex is measured by an electroencephalogram, EEG, that measures the brain's electrical activity. When this activity stops, the EEG readings go flat, they flatline, thus indicating no measurable brain electrical activity. In the absence of this measurable brain electrical activity, consciousness being in some way dependent on this activity also stops within about 10 to 20 seconds. And the tracing of this electrical activity is called an encephalogram within the cerebral cortex by means of a device called an electroencephalograph, which is an apparatus for detecting and recording electrical activity in the brain. This cessation of activity is death in that first sense. There is death in the sense of the permanent, irreversible cessation of vital activities, what in the context of near-death experience is called final death. So there is death in the sense of the permanent, irreversible cessation of vital activity, what in the context of near-death experience is called final death. Now, these two definitions of death in the context of discussing near-death experience are important, indeed necessary, because of the possibility that a near-death situation may be reversed in cases when the simple cessation of vital activities is itself able to be reversed, either spontaneously or by medical intervention. In other words, by the use of the electroencephalograph, either spontaneous or by medical intervention. And the person involved is no longer near death. When the cessation of vital activities is irreversible and therefore permanent, there is a distinctive situation of final death relative to the person who is undergoing a near-death experience, an NDE. To clarify this, what exactly is a near-death experience, an NDE? The term near-death experience was coined by the previously mentioned American academic and medical practitioner, or psychiatrist, Dr. Raymond Moody, and used in his epochal book, Life After Life. According to Dr. Moody, a near-death experience is, I quote, any conscious perceptual experience which takes place during an event in which a person could very easily die or be killed, or even may be so close as to be believed or pronounced clinically dead. In other words, breathing has ceased, heartbeat has ceased, but nonetheless survives and continues physical life. This is on all sides in passem. I might just repeat that near-death experience. Any conscious perceptual experience which takes place during an event in which a person could very easily die or be killed, and may even be so close as to be believed or pronounced clinically dead, but nonetheless survives and continues physical life. In turn, the Near Death Experience Research Foundation, the NEDA, as it's sometimes abbreviated to, the Near Death Research Foundation defines near death as the state of an individual who is physically compromised to the extent that death would be expected unless their physical condition improves. Those who are near death are generally unconscious and may be clinically dead with loss of breathing and heartbeat. The same NDE Research Foundation also offers a definition of the near-death experience. I quote, a lucid experience associated with perceived consciousness apart from the body, occurring at the time of actual or threatened imminent death. Now let's recall Iris Murdoch's statement that a death is the most terrible of facts. In the context of understanding death as it certainly is, a reality that inescapably involves the physical separation of a person from her or his loved and loving ones, one is more or less compelled to agree with Iris Murdoch. Let's get something out of that. One is more or less compelled to agree with Iris Murdoch. But is Murdoch's statement the only, I think, all that needs to be said about the reality that is death? Quite the contrary from the point of view taken by the near-death experience. From this point of view, death is the portal or point of entry into a new existence, a new life, a totally different mode of being that comes about within the world, within the world revealed by death. To cite Cindy Dale again, to live fully is to stand in the passageway between life and death. The Journey After Life, page 20. This is a passageway that leads into a life and existence that is freed from the limitations imposed by the physical world's factors of space, time, and gravity. A passageway that is an entrance into an existence, into a life that is wider, vastly more comprehensive, vastly more fulfilling than the existence, the earlier life within the constraints arising from physical matter itself. Those who have researched the nature of the near-death experience have consistently come up with the conclusion that the near-death experience includes some or all of the following elements. Elements that usually occur in an order that is also consistent. I'll just go quickly through these elements. 1, an out-of-body experience, an OBE, which doesn't hear me, in Order of the British Empire. An out-of-body experience, an OBE, that the experience, I'm having trouble seeing here, the experience of the experienced separation of consciousness from the physical body. That's the first item. An out-of-body experience, the experienced separation of consciousness from the physical body. Secondly, heightened sensory experiences through powers analogous to bodily sense powers, to powers of touching, tasting, smelling, seeing, hearing. 3, intense, generally positive emotions or feelings. 4, the experience of passing into or through a structure comparable to a tunnel. 5, encountering a brilliant light that is unwaveringly present in every direction. A light that fills everything and that emerges from everything. It is not merely being reflected by things. So It fills everything and emerges from everything in its own right, as it were. This light is sometimes described as mystical, in the sense of having a meaning or reality that is neither apparent to the senses nor obvious to the intellect. Sixth feature or element: encountering and being welcomed by other beings, in particular by deceased relatives or friends or mystical beings. And again, mystical beings, beings that fit into no category with which we are physically familiar and which may leave us floundering when we try to understand them. 7, being in time and place that are altered from the sort of time and space experienced in the physical world. 8, a review of one's life, either partial in the sense of focusing only on certain events from one's life, or panoramic in the sense of reviewing every event in one's life with distinct consideration of the impact of one's actions on other people and on surrounding realities, for example, on animals. 9, encountering realms totally transcending earthly, that is, physical realms. 10, experiencing a body of knowledge that is special in the sense of being different from all previously acquired bodies of knowledge. The knowledge that one has acquired about geography or about mathematics and so on. 11, encountering some sort of boundary or barrier beyond which there would be no possibility of a self or soul returning to life in this physical world. So a barrier, go beyond it, that's it. You're cut off forever from the physical world. And finally, a return of the self or soul to its physical body, a return that is either voluntary or involuntary. In other words, you want it or you don't want it, but it's forced upon you. Now, there are also certain distinctive psychological effects following a near-death experience. 1, a decrease in fear of death. 2, an increase in belief that the moment of death will be peaceful. 3, an increase in belief that a personal life after death, an increase in belief in a personal life after death. Stress on the adjective personal. 4, a decrease in belief that life after death will be unpleasant, that is, will involve suffering imposed externally. 5, an increase in belief that after death, one will be reunited with deceased loved ones. And 6, an increased belief in a transcendent, loving source and center of the whole of reality, that is, of consciousness and the cosmos. What must also be noted as of crucial importance is the language in which those who experience near death talk about their NDEs, their near-death experiences. One near-death experiencer speaks of, I quote, references by other experiencers to experiences similar to my own, all affirming the ineffability and ecstasy of the near-death experience that instantly dispersed the clouds of fear and doubt about the validity of my perceptions. That's cited in Kenneth Ring's marvelous book, Lessons from the Light, page 259. Another citation actually from the same work, page 263. I now, and this is one of Ring's clients, he was a psychologist. I now believe that death is truly a transition from our limited existence into a splendid new life, an adventure beyond our wildest dreams. In his book, Evidence of the Afterlife, The Science of Near-Death Experiences, page 2, the noted American radiation oncologist and near-death researcher, Dr. Jeremy Long, an American radiation oncologist, in other words, a medical specialist who concentrates on using radiation to treat cancer. Dr. Jeremy Long comments that respondents to my questioning described their experiences in a variety of ways, calling them unspeakable, ineffable, unforgettable, beautiful beyond words, and so on. Sir John Eccles, again, page 83 of his Facing Reality, Philosophical Adventures by a Brain Scientist, said, I believe that there is a fundamental mystery in my existence, transcending any biological account of the development of my body, including my brain, with its genetic inheritance and its evolutionary origin. And this is Eccles, I cannot believe that this wonderful gift of a conscious existence has no further future, no possibility of another existence under some other unimaginable conditions. Dr. Jeffrey Long, citing one of his patients who underwent a near-death experience, and this is the patient, this is the hardest thing to try to explain. Words will not come close to capturing the feelings, but I'll try. Total, unconditional, all-encompassing love, compassion, peace, warmth, safety, belonging, understanding, overwhelming sense of being home, and joy. And a remarkable statement from this patient of Dr. Lang. Words will not come close to capturing the feelings, but I'll try. Total, unconditional, all-encompassing love, compassion, peace, warmth, safety, belonging, understanding, overwhelming sense of being home, and joy. Well, this is all well and good, but what's the best evidence for understanding the near-death experiences? And I'm just going to use two quotes from Dr. Jeffrey Long's book from page 18. And he heads this section, Experience Provides the Best Evidence. And I'll just give two brief quotations from the book. Experience provides the best evidence. As far as I'm concerned, it makes perfect sense that the best evidence for understanding what happens when we die would come from those who actually did nearly die or even experienced clinical death, in other words, the cessation of breathing and heartbeat. This common sense perspective is certainly validated in the near-death experience research foundation study. The substantial majority of people who had a near-death experience believe their NDEs are real and are evidence of an afterlife. For NDEers, people have had this experience, having a near-death experience is their personal proof of both the reality of the NDE and an afterlife. And then he says in the same section, providing the best evidence. In science, confirming the reality of a concept generally comes not from a single observation or study, but from many independent studies with different methodologies. This cross-checking among scientific studies has always been the foundation for validating scientific discoveries. Thus, it is vitally important to note that the Near-Death Experience Research Foundation study findings are corroborated by hundreds of prior NDE studies conducted by scores of NDE researchers. Throughout this book, he's referring to his own book here, we cite many major NDE studies by other researchers. These other studies almost always make the same observations and come to the same conclusions as the NDERF study. This adds to the converging lines of evidence that lead me to conclude there is life after death. Oh, now I'll have to leave it there for own reason. You're probably sick and tired of hearing me. But I haven't been able really to finish off this paper because I've been in hospital. But I'm out and going well. So, David, that's it from me for the moment.
Well, thank you, Dr. Colin Goodwin, for your addressing the Existentialist Society on yourself, your consciousness, your death.
Thank you, David.